what changes are coming. So thank you. Our agenda for today. Let me share that. I am going to briefly share how to participate, some Zoom logistics, and then I will transfer the speaking role over to Janice Soriano Ramos to provide the presentation about the 2024 Transit Service Plan. At that point, we will open it up for your questions and your comments. And finally, we will close and talk about the next steps. So if you are unfamiliar, these are our Zoom keys to participate. Non-speakers will be muted during the meeting to reduce distractions. If you have a question for our staff, you are welcome to type your answer into the Q&A box to be answered later. Additionally, you are able to raise your hand to ask a question, which we will answer at the conclusion of the presentation. To do that, you can press the raise hand button on your toolbar, and I will ask you to unmute yourself so that we can hear you. If you are using phone audio instead of computer audio, the way to raise your hand is to press *9, and the way to mute and unmute yourself is to press *6. I want to note that we have both a chat function and a Q&A. The chat is helpful for us to share links or if you are experiencing audio or visual problems, but it moves, it's a little hard for us to track. So we do want to make sure that you use the Q&A for your questions, because that's the way we will make sure that they are being seen. And we just want to ask that anyone participating in today's meeting, whether you're speaking or you're typing, are respectful and courteous to both our staff and your fellow community members. So with us tonight, we have Janice Soriano Ramos, our Senior Transportation Planner and the Project Manager for our annual service plans. Myself, Deanna Bolio in Community Outreach, and Stephen Chi, Transit Service Development Specialist with a real focus on scheduling. The feedback we are looking to receive from you tonight, any relevant comments you have on the proposed service changes for 2024. We want you to think about what works for you, what doesn't, and if there are any concerns you would like to raise. And our roles here are to help explain the proposal, to pass your feedback on to the VTA board, and to use your feedback to make any revisions to the plan. And with that, I will stop talking and I will turn it over to Janice.
Thanks, Deanna, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Again, my name is Janice Soriano Ramos. I work on the transit service planning team here, and I am really pleased to see both familiar faces, or familiar names, I should say, and also some new names. So before I jump right into the 2024 plan, just for everyone's benefit, I wanted to walk you all through generally what we mean when we talk about a transit service plan. VTA has this annual transit service planning process where we really value connecting you all to what we've got planned for the next year. As much as VTA makes the decisions on these plans, this is your plan. So we want to be able to talk to you about what bus and light rail service should look like each and every year. Things like where routes travel and stop, how often our service comes, or how often our service operates, how early and late our service runs as well. So when we say service span and hours of operation, that's what we typically mean, is our hours of operation. And we started this annual service planning process, or we had all the intents of doing that ever since we did a complete redesign of our transit service plan back in December of 2019. Of course, the pandemic hit, and then we had just been able to truly start the annual service planning process last year, where we primarily talked about how we could recover our service and ramp our service back up to pre-pandemic service levels. So for those of you who joined us last year, thank you so much for engaging in that. That was a huge endeavor to be able to talk about all of the swift changes we wanted to make compared to what we rolled out in 2019. And, I thought that was a really effective way to do that. We met you in person, we met you virtually. So thanks again for tuning into that. This really is your plan. One happy thing that I really wanted to highlight is for those of you who have been tuning in to our Visionary Transit Network process, we did just get that plan adopted officially by our board last Friday. And this is huge. This is momentous. This is transformational because we now have this forward-looking plan where we can use these annual transit service plans to work towards more service, more frequency, longer hours of operation. Everything that we've proposed there, we now have a blueprint for every single one of these annual service plans. So Deanna, if you can transfer us over to the next slide. So I've hyped you all up about the annual service planning process and of course the visionary network, but this year's story is a little bit different. Of course, we're really looking forward to implementing that visionary transit network through every annual service plan we have, but we've got to start with recovering our service based on what we adopted in our 2023 service plan. Unfortunately, we are still limited by our operator shortage. We continue to hire back-to-back training classes. We've been hiring like we've never hired before. So I think we're still on track there, but some of the story is that we're not quite there yet. We're operating at about 93% of what we were operating before the pandemic. And until we can get our staffing up, until we can get enough bus operators to run the service, we can't really do much beyond what we've got planned from the 2023 service plan we adopted. But we will ramp up service accordingly every time we are able to. We are able to increase our service or make minor changes to our service 4 times a year. So once we hit that operator staffing minimum, then we'll be able to add more service. And we hope to do that before 2024, maybe early 2024 is when we can restore our service. So on the next slide, you might still be wondering what that full service looks like and what we have left to implement. I'm sure you noticed some of the shortcomings as you're writing our service, if you are a writer today, but to give you some perspective of what we've got left to restore, we still need to get our weekend rail frequencies back to every 20 minutes. There are some routes across our system that need to have some early morning and evening hours of operation restored. We're still looking to restore weekend service hours of operation as well on some routes. In the 2023 service plan, you may also remember we got proposed and adopted new weekend service on 3 of our routes, on 3 of our local routes that you see here. So that's a really exciting one that we have left to not recover, but actually make happen once we have enough operators to do that. And then lastly, I can't wait for this one to happen. The Route 71 used to be a local service, and that's the big item left that we really want to make sure we can run as a frequent route, as one that runs every 15 minutes on weekdays. So just to give you a sense of how our annual service planning timelines look like on a regular basis, it'll typically look like this. We spend the springtime developing the draft plan. That's usually when we have a sense of whether we can scale up our service a little bit, or if there are some ways we could make minor changes or major changes along the way. That's when we typically know. So we spend that time developing a draft plan. We then open up that draft plan to have the community weigh in throughout the summer, provide feedback, suggestions, and then we close off our community engagement to give us enough time in August to revise the plan and incorporate any feedback you have that would affect our original proposal. Then we spend a couple of months bringing the proposal, the staff recommendation, to our committees. We have several committees that weigh in on this item. Once they hear what you all have to share on this, we then get it adopted by our board in October. And then January of the following year is when the service that's been adopted in the final plan, that's when that all gets implemented in January 2024. All right. So to paint some general themes about this 2024 service plan, of course, I mentioned what we've got to do first is prioritize our full service restoration. So putting that aside, we've got all of these other minimal sort of changes, but these are changes that nonetheless we feel are really important to communicate through this annual service planning process. For one, we are proposing some changes to how we operate our late night light rail service. We are essentially proposing that the last few trips on each one of our lines gets transitioned over to become bus service during the late night hours. And it should only affect the last hour, roughly the last hour of service on light rail. And this is really to help accommodate any rail maintenance that needs to happen. This is really a priority to operations, and this is something that we've been working with them on to see if there's any wiggle room we can make in the late hours so that they could get more rail maintenance tasks out there. We also are proposing some minor routing changes on the 56, namely, but evening frequency changes are some proposals we're making for the other routes here. So they're really minor frequency changes there. The Rapid 500, which is our connector between Berryessa and Diridon, that is going to have a pretty immediate schedule change here. But this is something that we foresee being a long-term change. So we really found it important to get adopted as part of our 2024 plan. BART is planning to change their schedules effective October of this year. September this year. And so the proposal we're making for the Rapid 500 to match the BART schedule change in October would happen in October when we make our minor changes. There's also a collection of school-oriented route adjustments we're making. The Route 51's up there, which I'll talk a little bit more in detail about in a later slide. But we're also working directly with Gunn High School and with the school districts to talk about some solutions related to the 288 school series that I'm mentioning here to make sure that it's meeting actual school demand for the following school year, starting in August 2024. And then lastly, for these two rapid routes, we are considering adding some potential new stops along these routes. So these aren't stops that would be changes to the routing per se, but they're stops that we are proposing along its existing alignment. So I'll talk a little bit about that in another slide. All right, so getting in depth on some of these, I mentioned we are proposing some changes to late night light rail coverage. And this is, again, really to accommodate some additional time that would be necessary for rail maintenance. This is a really crucial time period where we think this would really help out our maintenance crew. I would say in a nutshell, this is the service hours are basically staying the same. So we are not really cutting service or late night light rail coverage any earlier than we do today. We are running out of Mountain View earlier and getting to Alum Rock later in what we're proposing here, but by no means do we want to create this huge impact late at night. The big transition here is that we would convert some of these later trips in certain direction to bus service. So for example, I'll just walk through all of them actually. For the green line heading towards Winchester, the last train that's headed towards Winchester would essentially pick up from Santa Clara Station as bus service and continue serving each one of those stations along the way. For Santa Teresa, the last southbound trip would continue as bus service starting at Santa Clara and make its way down to all the stations through Santa Teresa. The two last northbound trains that are heading up towards Bay Point and to Alum Rock, you would get coverage starting at Civic Center. It would then hit all of the stations all the way up to Bay Point and then also continue its way down to Alum Rock and hit all the stations along the way there. And then lastly, the last three westbound trips that are coming from Alum Rock would then drop off at Bay Point and then continue as bus service at every single station from Bay Point to Fair Oaks. But after Fair Oaks, it'll act as an express service headed towards Mountain View. So there wouldn't be any bus coverage in between those stops. On the next slide, this slide speaks to the pretty exciting change that we are proposing for Route 56. And this has been a long time request from many riders of Route 56, and our service planning team also feels it's a great suggestion to be able to provide that coverage along Alma, heading east from Tamian Station. And it also will provide those really crucial connections to many frequent routes along Monterey Road. So what would happen here is we would extend that service further out from Tamian Station, run down Monterey Road, and make that turnaround right on Old Tully Road there. On the next slide, I mentioned we are also making some swift changes to Route 51. And this decision, or this change that staff is considering, is both school driven or school demand driven, but it's also driven from a route assessment or a route evaluation that we worked on with consultants. And we really wanted to focus on Route 51 and have a unbiased third party, a consultant, really look at the performance of this route and see what we could do to make the route more productive, but also make sure that it's making every connection that we've promised to the high schools through Route 51 and 51H. So the big changes here that we're proposing are, instead of having the 51 operate along Grant Road there, we would just operate every single one of our Route 51 trips along Truman and Bryant. We would discontinue the Route 51H altogether, which is something we actually proposed in the 2023 service plan anyway. So that would remain the same. That proposal is remaining the same. But for those of you who tuned in last year, you may recall that we had envisioned Route 51 to be a 30-minute frequent route, or a route that runs every 30 minutes end to end. And after working with our consultants on this and making those assessments and looking at the ridership and seeing what the productivity was at some of these stops, that recommendation didn't really shine through. So what we're seeing now, especially as we're getting closer to recovering not just our service, but also our ridership and seeing what the demand is, we're thinking keeping that recommendation to operate every 30 minutes on the portion of Route 51 north of De Anza. And the portion south of De Anza would stay to operate at every hour. Then last couple slides here. I had mentioned we are exploring some new stops we'd like to add on 2 of our rapid routes. So I'll start with the Rapid 523 here. Today, we do have Rapid 523 serving our stops, our pair stops, or my tongue twister here. Yeah, our pair of stops at Santana Row. So that is going to stay, but after some operator comments we've received, and even from some riders who felt that it would be beneficial to have another stop pair in that area, we are looking into having a couple of stops just west of Winchester Boulevard there. And both of these pairs of stops would exist. So, we're not taking any stops away here, but we felt, after looking at how this route was operating and the demand as well, that these additional stops would be of benefit. So that, of course, will be dependent on what we work out with the city as far as the specific locations of these stops. And then finally, an exciting one here, we want to look at some potential new locations for some stops along the 568. We're looking at 4 currently, and I'll be honest and I'll say that not all of these are the easiest to get, and depending on what we find in working with the cities and what sort of updates or what sort of improvements we can make along this route, we may not be able to get all of these, but I think the most promising ones so far will be the ones we're proposing at Monterey and Burnett or Tilton. and Monterey and Wright. And I know we get several comments about suggestions for where to add these new 568 stops. We did just begin this service about a couple years ago in 2021. So we're definitely open to feedback about potential new locations for this stop, or for this route, excuse me. So that was my last slide as far as talking through some of the content for the 2024 plan. I didn't go through every single one of the proposals, but just as a reminder, we do have every single one of our proposals for 2024 on our project webpage, vta.org/2024 service plan. And just like last year, we have it laid out in a table form so that you can see how it compares to what we proposed last year. So feel free to peruse the website there. Another thing too is if you are curious to see what we've got left to implement for the 2023 service plan, we did update the original table that we created for the 2023 service plan to give you a sense of what's left. And unfortunately, none of them have an ETA because it really is contingent on how many more operators we can get. But at least it'll give you a sense of what we have left to restore in our service. We are taking feedback until the 7th of next month. Feel free to shoot those over to customer service, or if you want to give them a call, they'll be happy to take your feedback that way too. And anything that's 2024 service plan related gets directly funneled over to myself and Stephen and everyone else on the service planning team to take a look at. So with that, the next slide. To highlight some next steps here, I mentioned we're taking feedback on this plan until July 7th. That is our drop dead deadline for public comments so that we have enough time to make the revisions throughout the summer and then bring the staff recommendation back to our board in October. And then we'll begin that service January 15th of next year. So with that, I think I turn it back over to you, Deanna, to get us started with Q&A.